And I think that that idea of having a community resource, you know, the notion of, from Hillary Clinton, it takes a village. Well, in fact, it does take a village to educate a student. But that village today is a global village. It's a global community where we have expertise that students can use and take advantage of. And so this idea of collaboration is important. The other aspect around collaboration is how students collaborate with each other. Often it was, well, okay, I'm going to assign a group project, and I do it with the same class because the students share physical space and they have to work with someone. Well, today, one can have a group assignment, but the group could be made up of a student from Australia and a student from Canada and a student from Europe. While there are different time zones, the project is the same. The learning outcomes across curriculums and countries is more or less going to be the same. And we can teach students how to collaborate across the globe. And we can justify that investment in educating them to do that because that's the world of work that they're going to work in. And that's the way they actually communicate today. If you think about this change, I've often talked about what it's like today compared to what it was like before, whatever before was. Today, if you go on vacation with your children and you are going to go camping, and you go camping in a place where there's no internet access, I'm sure you're going to get some pushback from many of them. How am I going to communicate with my friends? You know, how am I going to have access to my online community as I shift my physical presence to a different community? Well, if we do that in our social lives, the opportunity to use that same technology and orientation in learning presents itself. And I think that you'll find that some teachers today are using this connection, either through personal connections or other teacher learning networks, to allow students to work across time zones and across countries, if not across continents. I think the other thing that we need to think about is the notion of interdisciplinarity. Now, that's a term that we would use in university because interdisciplinary research is what it's all about today. But in fact, the schools can actually teach the university about interdisciplinary work and research because that's what we've done for years. That's what schools are all about. It's about combining subject matter in a variety of areas around projects. And so math and science and writing and illustration, we think of that on a daily basis and say, well, that's how we do our work. Which really now talks about one of the last sort of items that I think is really important for teachers to consider. And that is how we talk about what we do. Because often we talk about what we do in terms of our peer group, and our peer group tends to be other teachers. So we say, well, we've done a project, it's about global warming, and students are going to collect some data. And, you know, they did pretty well. How often do you hear that kind of expository rhetoric? We don't say, I've conducted and designed an interdisciplinary project that took real-time data, which was analyzed using powerful software to develop long-term trends that will affect students in the 21st century, if not the 22nd century. And we tried to place that within an international context of the policies around global warming. What I've just described is exactly the same project, but the language is different. And I think that teachers owe it to themselves and owe it to the community to talk about what they're doing in terms that will be understood in a wider audience. And to not just talk about it, but to use the power of technology to make others aware of the successful activities that are taking place in school. I think the second thing is to provide teachers an opportunity for a place to play and experiment safely. Often what we find is that we have lone rangers. And so we know that lone rangers will do innovative work, and how do we take the lone ranger and actually put it into the early majority and the vast majority of teachers? Well, one of the ways of doing that is disseminating what lone rangers do to the rest and doing some independent research around what would help teachers do that. I think that if teachers were actively engaged in developing their own notions of professional practice, so rather than being dictated to, taking some of the constraints off and having teachers define their own workplace based on their own achievement, which goes some ways to addressing that. I think they need tools. I think they need time. I think they need a lot of things. Now, part of the problem is, how do we do that in today's environment where professional development is so expensive? And we also think that the only way to do professional development is to do it during working time. Well, in fact, I think there are other ways of doing that. I think there's other ways of motivating faculty, motivating teachers to do that. I think the opportunity to publicly share is one way. I think giving them the tools. How often do teachers not have computers at their desk, do not have access to the internet, do not have development tools, do not have the kind of setup that you currently see me being taped around? And what you can't see in this video is there are cameras, there are people working this, there are lights, etc. Teachers don't have that in school. So how can you have teachers actually produce and be active participants in the modern world if they don't have the tools? So there's a teaching-learning dynamic here. And so I've talked a lot about teaching, but I haven't talked a lot about learning. Now, I'm not sure that people learn differently today. I don't think we've rewired ourselves as human beings to be able to learn differently, but the conditions in which we learn are different, and the resources that we provide learners are different. And it's not just a technology question, but it's a question of practice, which is really also about how we teach. But the practice of learning today is different. We have somehow created an environment where students produce work and this work is judged, and it almost becomes a marketplace of reward and punishment. And so we've lost that sense of intrinsic reward that students have. Has that happened because we have a very structured curriculum? Has that happened because we don't teach students how to manage their learning? Do we not teach students how to think about learning in ways that they can find reward in? Now, if you think about that, think about a student who is given a new computer, or a student that has a hobby or has an intense interest as we have when we're young. I suppose we have it when we're old, but we certainly have it when we're young. And think about how quickly they acquire the skills, knowledge, and attitude in things that they are highly motivated about. We find that they will learn at twice the rate, I suppose, if one wants to quantify that, compared to some subjects that they find difficult. And why is that? Well, certainly we know that motivation plays a large role. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is the motivation and what is the environment in which learning takes place? Can we find a role for technology, but can we find a role in technique? Can we find ways to engage students in a discussion about what they want to learn and when they want to learn? You know, back a long time ago, when I was just studying to be a teacher, you know, we talked about open schooling, we talked about different ways of engaging students in defining their own goals. Certainly that was an idealistic period, and I'm not sure that it translates to a large system implementation. But I think we can start nibbling at the edge of what that looks like today. I think we can start talking about self-management. I think we can talk about teaching people how to learn rather than teaching them what they should learn. I think that the former will have a greater effect upon the latter than just teaching them static information, because today what is required to be successful in the modern world is students who can create knowledge, not students who can parrot back static information. And there is a substantial difference there.